So in our text this morning, there's basically two issues that we are going to encounter that are givens for all of us. It is the issue of suffering, and it is the issue of interruptions. Both of them happen, we experience both of them. Some of you perhaps here this morning are in the midst of one or both of those, of a way in which sometimes life just interrupts, like you think you have it all planned, ironed out, mapped out, and then life just has a way of stopping things. Some of us are in the midst of suffering. Some of us, as we look, I was like, what illustration should I use to talk about suffering and interruptions? And I'm like, well, just read the newspaper, right? We do not have to go, well, I don't know, does anyone read the newspaper anymore? But whatever device you read, we do not have to look far to see suffering, to see lives interrupted. And where this leads us in the midst of trying to process all of that is often it leads us to a place of fear and uncertainty. Where is God in the midst of all of this? And so in our encounter this morning, or in our story and our text in front of us this morning, I want to talk about how in two different cases where people are dealing with this issue of suffering, how Jesus walks through that with them. What it is that he says, what it is that he does. It's the story of Jairus and the story of a woman who had a blood flow for 12 years. Two very different people, as you will hear this story. But the teaching in this, I think, has something to say to us about how we walk through life's interruptions and how we deal with the suffering and the grief and the loss that we see around us. So we are in Mark chapter 5. We're going to be starting at verse 21 and reading through verse 34. When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue leaders named Jairus came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. He pleaded earnestly with him, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." So Jesus went with him. Now a large crowd followed and pressed around him. And a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had. Yet instead of getting better, she got worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, "If I just touch his clothes, I will be healed." Immediately her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once, Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around to the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" "You see the people crowding against you," his disciples answered, "and yet you can ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, and trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." Jairus is a leader of the synagogue. He is successful. He's not a priest. He's not a rabbi, but he has been elected by the leadership of that synagogue to lead them. He is in a place of prominence. He is known, and he is desperate. His 12-year-old daughter is near death. But he knows that Jesus can heal. And he thinks, if I just get into the presence of Jesus, if I just can fall down in front of him, if I can just tell him the story, then perhaps he will come and heal her. And that's precisely what happens. He falls down in faith and in fear, in expectation and in hope, but also with probably a sense of grounded reality of, can Jesus really heal his daughter? The invitation, "Jesus, please come with me." And Jesus goes with him. And they're making their way to the house of Jairus in order that Jesus might touch his daughter and might heal her, when all of a sudden there's a major interruption. As Jesus is walking through the crowd and people are pressing in on him and perhaps obviously touching him and everything else, he feels power go out of himself. He knows that something has happened. And he stops. And he begins to ask, "Who touched me?" And the woman who touched him is just pretty much the opposite of Jairus. She is an unknown. She is outcast. She's been bleeding for 12 years, which makes her unclean. Means that no one really wanted to touch her, be near her. And she is desperate as well. And she gets close to Jesus and she reaches for his cloak, thinking that if I just touch him, I will be healed. Desperation. 12 years of separation and isolation. And in that day, there was a thinking that if you touched that which was holy, you yourself could be cleansed, you yourself could become holy. It comes out of the book of Exodus, chapter 29, verse 37, when Moses is given the directions, the instructions of how to create the Ark of the Covenant and how to create the worshiping liturgical pieces that the nation of Israel would use. And so this is what Exodus 29, verse 37 says, "For 7 days make atonement for the altar and consecrate it. Then the altar will be most holy, and whatever it touches, and whatever touches it will be holy." If I can just touch Jesus. And she touches him. And she's healed. And she knows that something has happened that she could never make happen before, that she had spent all of her money, that she had been humiliated. She had spent money on these things of the world that said were going to heal her, and none of them had worked. And she's like, if I just get close enough to Jesus, if I just touch him, I'll be restored. And she's restored. And you can imagine her just kind of trying to get out of the crowd, and Jesus stops. And he has the audacity to ask, "Who touched me?" His disciples are like, "Come on, Lord, seriously? There's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people all around you. They're all touching you. They're all clamoring around you." But he knows there was one touch that was different. A touch that took power out of him and was given to someone else. And my friends, this is astounding. That Jesus literally stops for someone who is unclean, for someone who is an outcast, for someone who does not fit or does not belong. He stops and he waits. And he looks through the crowd so that he might extend his unconditional love to this one who had not been loved or known for over 12 years, for this one who had no place. And he simply stops and waits and looks. When we walk through suffering, loss, and grief, I want to remind us that we have a Savior who looks for us, who sees us for who we are, who loves us in spite of our brokenness, sinfulness, shame, whatever it is, and one who welcomes. This is the way God works. He is always looking to be in relationship. Yes, this woman needed to be healed, but what she really needed was to know Jesus And Jesus knows the healing is incomplete unless if he speaks to her, unless if he stops. You may recall in Genesis, after Adam and Eve sin, break the rules that God had given to them, what does God do? After the fall, what does God do? God goes looking for them. God does not turn his back on them. God does not just simply keep walking. Thank goodness Jesus stopped. Genesis chapter 3, verses 8 and 9. Then the man and his wife, Adam and Eve, heard the sound of the Lord God as he was walking in the garden in the cool of the day, and they hid, because remember, they now have to hide because they have broken covenant. So this is Genesis 3, 8 and 9. As he was walking in the garden in the cool of the day, and they hid from the Lord God among the trees in the garden. But the Lord called to the man, "Where are you?" Even in the midst of their shame, even in the midst of them breaking the rules, so to speak, what does God do? God says, "I'm coming and looking for you." In the midst of our own grief, in the midst of our own fear, in the midst of our own suffering, in the midst of the interruptions that life brings our way, I want to remind us that God still longs to be in relationship with you, that he comes looking for you. He stops. He waits. He pursues. Think of how Jesus just simply looked through the crowd until he found the woman whom he wanted to speak to. And she falls at his feet, trembling. Jesus has called. She just wanted to be healed and walk away. Lord, fix me, let me touch you, let me be restored, and let me walk away. And Jesus says, no, we're not done yet. And she falls at his feet. She says, she tells him her story. He says, your faith has healed you. And when he says that, he's not just describing her physical restoration, he is describing her spiritual restoration. But he wants to see her for a reason. And that is to speak a blessing over her life. And there's a second thing I want us to make sure we understand, that Jesus doesn't just stop in the midst of our loss and grief, he then speaks over us. He pronounces wholeness over her. He speaks a word of peace, a word of shalom, that word which means wholeness, completeness, satisfaction. He speaks that over her life because he doesn't want her to just be physically healed, to be physically restored. He wants her to know and understand that she is so loved that he longs to speak a blessing over her life. And I think for those of us, when we walk through life and our lives are interrupted by terrible, horrible stuff, or we are grieving, or we're walking with others who are grieving, there's a sense that we forget that Jesus speaks over you and me a word of blessing, a word of encouragement, a word of hope, a word of restoration. He doesn't just stop for our sake, but then he speaks into our lives. And I do not want you to forget that. That grief is all too real. But in the Gospel of John, as Jesus looks at his disciples, he says, my peace I give to you. Not as the world can give, but only as I can do. It is the peace which the Apostle Paul describes as the peace which surpasses all understanding. Romans chapter 8, this great chapter that Paul has, verses 31 and 32, he goes back to this idea of saying, remember what Christ has done. What then shall we say in response to these things? He's been talking about all this difficult stuff. If God is for us, who can be against us? He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also along with him graciously, and notice those words, graciously give us all things? This is the word of blessing over our lives. Paul's looking back at what Jesus has done and says, hey, in response to all these other things that have happened in the world, what can be done for us? What does God do for us? And he says, you know what God will do through Christ? He will graciously give us all things. So Jesus stops, Jesus looks, Jesus wants to be in relationship with you as you walk through this stuff. Jesus wants to speak his word of blessing over your life, but doggone it, guess what happens sometimes? You feel like Jairus. You've gone to Jesus to say, please come and heal my daughter, and what does Jesus have the audacity to do? As you are making your way to your house, he stops. And he gets into a conversation. And he's not healing. And he's not in a hurry. How did Jairus feel? I don't know how he felt. I can imagine how he felt. Come on, Lord, pick up the pace. Do you think he ever thought something like that? I'm sure none of us have ever said to Jesus, can you pick up the pace, right? Maybe I'm the only one in the room that has ever thought those sorts of things, kind of moving a little slow. And yet, what is Jairus watching? He's watching this woman have this incredible experience of believing and being filled with hope and being restored, and he's just waiting. And then if you know the story, the news comes from people from his home. They've come to Jesus and say, your daughter has died. In the waiting, she is no longer with us. And Jesus has this strange response. It's kind of like, no, she hasn't died. And he looks at Jairus and says, have faith. Don't fear, but have faith. Have a big enough faith that I am still in the midst of this. And that is a hard faith to have after what Jairus had just heard. And so they continue the journey because Jesus wants him to understand that his daughter is not truly dead. So we're going to pick up again in Mark chapter 5. We're going to skip over a couple of verses. And we're going to gather in the story now when they get to the home of Jairus. And this is verse 38. And we're going to read through verse 43, Mark chapter 5. When they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw a commotion with people crying and wailing loudly. He went and said to them, why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep. But they laughed at him. It's probably the second time people have laughed at Jesus in this story, because I'm sure his disciples said the same thing. After he put them all out, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, Talitha kum, which means, little girl, I say to you, get up. Immediately the girl stood up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. At this, they were completely astonished. He gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this and told them to give her something to eat. We'll say more about that in just a moment. Jesus does not accept the finality of the statement of the news that this man of Jairus' friends had brought to him. He says, I want to go to the home and I want to be in the room where she is. And he walks into that room with a couple of his apostles and her parents. And he takes her hand, probably kneels down, takes her by the hand and says, little girl, It's a term of endearment. It's a term of affection that the Aramaic there that's translated. He says, little girl, get up. It's like when you try to wake your kids or your grandkids up, right? My daughter was never like this one. This was never like, the terms of endearment were not terms of endearment after a while with my daughter. She did not like to get up in the morning, right? That's not what's being described here. But here is Jesus at the side of the bed, taking this little girl's hand and saying, wake up. It's a new day. Wake up. I have something for you to do. Wake up. The end is not here. I think the third thing that we see in this story, besides Jesus stopping and Jesus speaking, is Jesus coming alongside us and saying, get up. Because this is what happens to us. When the suffering, when the grief, when the sorrow, when the interruptions happen, we move very easily into a room filled with the word no. And I don't mean K-N-O-W, I mean N-O. Some of you have probably been in that room. Some of you perhaps today are in that room. It is a room where there is no hope, there is no life, there is no expectation, there is no curiosity, there is nothing. It is a room filled with no. It is dark and dreary. And guess who shows up? Jesus comes in and says, let me take you by the hand. And let me help you up. Because there is life yet to be lived. And so for Jairus, who in that moment just previously had thought, is there any hope? Is there any life? Is there any expectation? Is my life constantly going to be defined by the word no? There is all of a sudden life. There is all of a sudden hope. Suffering did not have the last word. And then this line, by the way, would you please get her something to eat? I always love these little jabs of like just a little fun there at the end. But if you think about the gospel, how often is a meal involved? How often do people gather around a table? N.T. Wright puts it like this. I love his phrase, particularly as we're coming to the Lord's table in just a moment. He said, when Jesus himself wanted to explain to his disciples what his forthcoming death was all about, he didn't give them a theory. He gave them a meal. Something tangible. We can talk theoretically, philosophically, biblically, theologically around suffering and loss and grief and uncertainty and fear. There have been lots and lots and lots of books written about that, theorizing around it. But I love what N.T. Wright says. He says, look, if we want to understand what the death of Jesus is all about, we look to a meal. A meal that reminds us of the body that was broken and the blood that was shed. A meal where we understand the one who went through suffering so that we might be restored. So a couple of questions and then we're going to come to the Lord's table. Actually, one's kind of a statement, I think, actually. Interruptions often teach us something. Think of a lesson or two that you learned when your life was interrupted. Because here's what happens. We get busy, and we forget about these things. That when there are these interruptions, it is often God trying to teach us something. And the second one is this, and perhaps this is the one you reflect on as we come to the Lord's table. Is there a place in your life where you need to hear or receive the word of peace that Jesus can offer to you. That word of blessing that Jesus needs to speak over your life, that place in your heart where you are grieving, where you are suffering, where you are fearful. Do you need to hear the word of Jesus, the voice of Jesus, speaking peace to you?